everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to talk about my October reads. This will be my October reading wrap-up, and there were a couple of books that I already reviewed in other videos, and I'll just briefly mention those books, but I won't necessarily talk about them in depth. I read a total of 10 books in October, which is, I think, the lowest that I've read all year to this point. So, but some of those were very large books, so that's probably why. So the first book that I read was a book that I talked about in my last Shorty September vlog of September, and that was Fatty Legs by Christy, Jordan-Fenton, and I can't read my own writing, Margaret-Fenton, her mother-in-law. And that was a children's book about the experience of an Indigenous woman who was sent to residential school in Canada. It was excellent. I really enjoyed that book. Please check out my last Shorty September vlog to get a full review of that one. And then I finished a graphic novel for middle graders, and that was called Katie the Catsitter by Colleen, Venable, and Stephanie Yu, I believe. My writing was very tiny and not neat. So there'll be a picture up here. This was a very delightful middle grade graphic novel about a girl who is trying to raise money to go to summer camp. And so she takes on a cat sitting job. That is not what it appears to be, because the lady that she starts cat sitting for has like hundreds of cats in her apartment. And these cats are not your typical cats. And there are some superhero shenanigans, and this young girl and these cats get up to shenanigans, and it's just delightfully good fun, and I would highly recommend it. If you enjoy these sorts of middle grade young people graphic novels that are just fun and a good time, this was a good one, and I enjoyed my time with it. I have since donated that book to my daughter's 3rd and 4th grade classroom, and so that's the age group that book was meant for, so I donated it on to them. I then completed book 3 in the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. This is The Wastelands, and this particular copy has the full page color illustrations in it. And in this book, our gunslinger, our main character, and his 2 companions are continuing on trying to complete their journey to the Dark Tower, and they are traveling through this other world, this secondary world, sort of a parallel world to where we live, that has gone through some kind of apocalyptic type of a disintegration of culture and landscape. So they're traveling through this like very sparse land with this almost like not quite desert, but almost, and they're trying to get to the Dark Tower, but there's a lot of obstacles in the way and have to overcome those obstacles. And I don't want to go into too much detail because it is book 3 in a long-running series, and don't want to give any spoilers, but the train on the cover is a major part of the storyline. So there is some technology in this world, but not technology, like not everything that we currently have still exists in this post-apocalyptic world. And it's just very good fun. It's dark fantasy, and the characters are really interesting, and Stephen King can tell a great story. So yeah, enjoyed my time with that one. I then finished 2 books during the mid-month book bash in October, and I fully reviewed those books in that video. The first one was The Spellshop by Beth Durst, and that was a cozy fantasy, which was absolutely delightful. I just really had a great time reading that one. And then I also finished this mystery novel, The Appeal by Janice Hallett, which is a mystery that's told through like text messages and emails and reports, and you have to sort of piece it all together. So that was also good fun. As you can see, in October, I was reading a lot of comfort read type things, escapist reading, anything to get myself out of my own head. But then I did get serious, and I completed my biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is FDR by Jean Edward Smith. You can see I tabbed it up. These tabs represent every time the book talks about Campobello Island, New Brunswick, which is very near to where I live, so I really appreciated the discussion how the Roosevelt family ties into Campbell Island and the time that Roosevelt throughout his life spent on the island and in the local area, which was really cool for me to read about. Also, this is an excellent example of a biography. It is very detailed. I mean, this is a long one, but it's well told. It keeps your attention. It's not just focused on the minutia of the decisions that were made or the actions that were taken, but rather it focuses on Roosevelt as a person, what motivated him, what his personality was like, how the people around him saw him, and what their reaction to him was. And it gets a little bit into the history as well, but not very much. Like, this does not, I mean, obviously World War II starts in the middle of his presidency, and it does not go into depth about the events of World War II. So if you're looking for like those specific history descriptions, that's not in here. It doesn't talk about the battles of World War II or anything. It talks about Roosevelt's personal reactions to events that happened during that time and the decisions that he made himself that impacted different events. And I thought it was just very well done, and it has sent me down a rabbit hole of reading other things about FDR and this time period. So stay tuned for more about that in my November reading wrap up. And then I finished The Summer Without Men by Siri Hustvedt, which was an ebook that I read from Everand, and I buddy read this with Britta Bowler, and this was my first book by this author. And I found this to be superb. I thought this was an excellent read. This is a story of a woman who has been married for 30 years. She's in her 50s, and her husband decides one day that he needs a break from their marriage, and the break involves his much younger co-worker. And so this sets off basically a nervous breakdown in his wife, and she gets sent to a hospital to recover. And after she gets out of the hospital, she decides that she's going to take the summer and she's going to teach she's a poet, and she's going to teach a poetry class. She's going to teach a poetry workshop for like preteen girls, like 12-year-old girls, in the town where her mother resides in an assisted living facility. And so this book is from the point of view of our main character, this woman who's been, basically had her marriage blown up through no fault of her own. But it also talks about the experiences of women at different stages in their life. So you have these young preteen girls in this writing workshop and what's going on with their relationships. You have her mom in an assisted living facility with her elderly female friends and what's going on with that age group. You have our main character, this female poet in her 50s, and how she's dealing with what's going on in her life and her interactions with all of these other women. It's funny, it's poignant, it's heartwarming, it's so much excellent things to say about feminism and family and marriage and life stages and all that sort of thing. I just thought it was super, super good read, and I definitely want to read more by Siri Hustvedt. Then I finished, what came after that? I finished Valley of the Birdtail, An Indian Reserve, A White Town, and The Road to Reconciliation by Andrew Stobo Sniderman and Douglas Sanderson. So this author team is made up of a white man and a indigenous man, and they together wrote this book about this town, Birdtail. It's actually, Birdtail is the river, that divides Rossburn and Wayway-Sakapo, which is an Indian reserve in Canada. And so this book, this was so well done. I buddy read this with my friend Rachel, and we both really loved this. It is superbly told. So it goes chapter by chapter where it talks about different, in the beginning of the book, it sort of lays out the historical framework for these two communities and individuals from each of the communities, or I would say families from each of the communities. So a certain white family and a certain indigenous family. And over time, how these two communities have either gotten along or not gotten along, and how the greater historical events occurring in Canada and Canada's, the federal government of Canada, the decisions that are made about how to manage Indigenous populations, how that impacts these two communities specifically. This talks about residential schools. It talks about education in the present day in Canada and what resources are available to Indigenous communities versus white settler communities. Just so well told. Really brings in the people involved in a way that just brings them to life. Because this talks about history that took place like 100 years ago and all the way up to the present day, even more than 100 years ago, I would say. I thought that this just, it pulled everything together so well. Just when you thought, like in the beginning, when it's talking about a lot of the historical things, you're like, well, how is this going to relate to this present day community? But the authors bring it back really well. And they describe the history of white settler government's relations with Indigenous communities in North America. I think probably the best that I've ever read. And I've been doing a lot of reading in this sort of area of this topical area over the last several years. And I think this is probably one of the best done ones that I've read. And I first heard about this book over at Sean Breathes Books channel. He had an interview with either one or both of the authors, and he had read this book and raved about it. And so that's how it got on my radar. And I'm so glad that Rachel and I decided to pick this up and buddy read it together. It was really an excellent book. If you are at all interested in the history of the relationship between governments, the current governments of Canada or the United States, and the Indigenous people who were here on the continent when anybody from Europe showed up, I think you should read this book because it's really well done. And it really will give you great insight into where we are in the present day with those relationships. And then I did read The Forgotten Botanist, which was the Book Naturalist Book Club pick, and that was by Wynne Brown. And I did a whole separate standalone review on that book, and so you can check that out to see my thoughts on that. And then lastly, for Victober, I read Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Very chunky Victorian book, and I buddy read this over the course of the month with Kim from Middle of the Book March and Britta Bowler, and we just had a fantastic time reading this book together and discussing it. This is a satirical Victorian novel that follows two characters, Becky Sharp and Amelia Sedley, who were schoolgirls together at a boarding school type of a situation. At the very beginning of the book, they're just graduating and leaving and heading out into the adult world. And so you follow these two young women throughout their lives, and they have very similar experiences in that they marry men who don't have much financial means, but how they respond to that situation in each of them is very different. And so this is, as I said, a satire that's taking on English society, class structures, sort of cultural traditions, and the ridiculousness of it all. The idea that just because you have money, you're somehow better than somebody else, or that just because you marry into a family that has a certain social standing, that you somehow are a good person. I mean, I think the author takes great pains to make sure that none of his characters are particularly good people. They are all flawed in some way, and they're flawed in ways that are quite humorous, or frustrating, depending on your perspective. The naming in here is just hysterical. I would say that this book was, for me, it was like if Jane Austen and Anthony Trollope had a baby and the baby wrote a book, this would be the book that the baby would write. This combines the humor and politics of a Trollope novel with sort of the discussion of social expectations and class boundaries that you would find in a Jane Austen novel. So for me, this was a great success. I do think that because this was originally a serialized novel, there is a lot of filler in here, and that actually got worse for me over time, so that by the end I was pretty like over Thackeray's padding of this story. I mean, I get why he did it, because this was how he earned money, was serialization of this novel, and like the longer he could make it last, the more money he was going to make. I get that. But as for a modern reader, I think that can be a very frustrating aspect of Victorian novels. And, you know, there was a lot in here that could have been cut, and you would not have lost anything of the story. So yeah, that was my one caveat or my one complaint with it. But overall, I did enjoy my time, and I'm really glad to have finally read this and gotten it off my shelf. And I haven't owned my copy for a long time, but this was a book that I had put on my bucket list of books that I wanted to read. That whole Mooks and Gripes bucket list thing that went around BookTube for a while, a couple of years ago. This was one of the ones on my top 10 books that I wanted to get to at some point in my life. And so now I can cross that one off, which feels pretty good. So that's it. Those are the 10 books that I read in the month of October. It was a very good reading month. Some of those books were really long, and all of them, you know, I got something out of. So that's always positive. I hope you had a good reading month in October. I hope you're doing well and finding some great books to read now, and I will talk to you later.